If you want to go ahead and there we go. It's official. So we, as a book club, Forest Talks and Forest Walks, has been reading Smokescreen, and it's a really incredible book. We had our first book club a month ago, and it was full of amazing discussion and questions. And we're lucky enough today to have Chad. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Laura, another one of our book club leads, and she's going to do an introduction and get the ball rolling for Chad. So welcome, and as everyone pops in, looks like Kaya, you got the mute button for everyone coming in, so that's great. So yep, go ahead, Laura. Let's rock and roll.
Hey, thanks, Daniel. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. For those of you that joined us last time, thank you so much for joining us again tonight. For any newcomers, or just as a reminder, as Daniel mentioned, we are the Forest Talks and Forest Walks Book Club, co-hosted by myself and Kaya and Daniel. And we're so glad to be sharing this space with you. This club was born out of a shared love and curiosity for forest ecosystems and a desire to learn more about them. Forest Talks and Forest Walks is a collaboration between the Center for Responsible Forestry, Resources, the Whatcom Million Trees Project, and the Legacy Forest Defense Coalition. Together, we're creating a welcoming space for community members who want to dig deeper into the truth about our local forests, challenge conventional thinking, and explore a more hopeful path forward through discussion, learning, and outdoor connection. Last time we met up, we dug into Smokescreen together, which most of you are familiar with by now. We wrestled with myths, questioned long-held assumptions about fire, and probably left with more questions than answers, which to me is always the sign of a good book. And tonight we get to bring those questions and everything we've been turning over since directly to the source. So tonight we're incredibly honored to welcome the author himself, Dr. Chad Hanson, to join our discussion. Chad is a research ecologist, co-founder of the John Muir Project, and one of the most vocal advocates for rethinking our relationship to wildfire. His work challenges long-standing assumptions, raises tough questions, and reminds us that science and storytelling are both essential tools for change. So, Chad, we've all come to this book from different places, some with years of forest work under their belts, and others with a newer connection. Um, but just to kind of get things kind of warmed up, I just wanted to ask you if you had one wish for how readers walk away changed by this book, what would it be?
Well, that's a great question. I guess first of all, hi everybody. Thanks for coming tonight and having this discussion with me. I think the main thing that I would like people to take away from the book is that fire does not destroy forest ecosystems. The evidence just really doesn't support that conclusion. Even large fires, even large high intensity fire patches, they have a historical role. We have a lot of history indicating that those events did occur before fire suppression and logging. It's a natural part of the ecosystem, and they're very biodiverse. But fires do and can destroy communities, and they can destroy homes, they can destroy entire neighborhoods, and they can claim lives, human lives. So that's what I'd really like people to take away from the book, is that we just have to do a 180-degree rethink of our forest policies and our wildland fire policies, which are right now overwhelmingly focused on backcountry management of vegetation of all types, including forests, thinking we're going to stop the fires from reaching towns. And meanwhile, we're spending almost no time, energy, resources actually helping communities become fire safe, and they're paying the price for that. And we've seen a lot of that even since I wrote Smokescreen.
Awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate that response. With that, I am actually going to hand it off to Daniel. He's going to be guiding us through the rest of the discussion. And we've got a lot of questions. So um, you're up, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks so much, Laura. Yeah, so on our first book club, we read through chapter 1 through 4, and then for this, we asked everyone to read up through chapter 10. And then in a month from now, we're going to visit a forest fire. We have a forest that had a wildfire, and there's a couple different locations that we're still deciding on. And so we decided to create the framework around today's discussion, mainly just based on everyone's questions on wanting to understand the book at a deeper level. I feel like most everyone has put a good amount of effort reading into it, and it's a very complicated and nuanced subject. And I think a lot of people are just trying to wrap their head around it, especially in the context of their own kind of level of experience and knowledge, and then also for us up here in the Pacific Northwest too, with our wetter, moister western Doug fir and cedar forests and so forth, west of the Cascades. So we have more than enough questions to rocket through our time tonight. But before we jump into them, I was just curious if you had anything that you wanted to address first or dig into, or kind of just riffing on what you would like to get out of this, Chad.
Oh, I'm here to answer your questions, so please ask any questions you want.
Okay, great. So we can just jump into it. Cool. So I have a long list. I'll just kind of start from the top. Um, One of them, and then I'm also curious about this as well. We have some photos of fires, and like the 25-mile fire in Chelan, and we'll get to that. But I think the first one that we'll start off with is what's the difference between clear-cut sediment runoff and wildfire runoff? Both cause sediment runoff, from my understanding. And this was brought up by an individual from the last book club, and I believe it was the Idaho legislator was pushing heavily for large-scale thinning operations to protect forests from wildfire, and really much hammering the messaging of protecting water supply from toxic sediment runoff. And that just seems a little counterintuitive because both of them produce sediment runoff, but I feel like wildfires are more natural than a thinning operation. So is that enough juice for you to kind of
Oh,
hop into
sure.
that question? Great.
Yeah, the difference is wildfires produce pulsed sedimentation. Logging produces chronic sedimentation. Very, very, very different. Pulse sedimentation is natural in the ecosystem. You have a wildfire, some areas burn a little hotter, it's on a steeper slope, you get a heavy rain later on, and you're going to get some runoff that's going to go down into the streams. That's been going on for millions of years. It's natural, and in fact, it's such an intrinsic part of the ecosystems that the stream ecosystem responds to this. It changes the stream chemistry. It delivers large down logs into the stream, which is really important for aquatic wildlife because it kills trees and they fall and roll downhill into the streams. And it increases aquatic insects, and those provide foods when they emerge from the aquatic environment. That provides food for fish, but it also provides food for fly-catching birds and bats, because when they emerge from the aquatic environment as adults, they fly away. We actually have a whole chapter on that specific subject in a fire ecology textbook that some colleagues and I wrote, and I co-edited back in 2015, called The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix. The first edition, yeah, the first edition of that, we came out with a second edition, which is last year. The first edition had the chapter on the aquatics, because we changed it up. We largely rewrote the book, but the 2015 version has that if you want more information. Bottom line is this, is that what researchers have found is that the pulsed sedimentation sometimes reduces fish populations slightly, modestly, for 1 or 2 years. Then they go up to higher than they were before the fire, typically. And the most of the sedimentation after wildfire happens in the first winter after a fire, and then it drops off dramatically. When logging occurs, including not just clear cutting, but also thinning, because you're talking about skid trails, landings, logging roads, that's chronic sedimentation, and that will deliver sediment into the streams over and over and over again every year, oftentimes for 20 years. And the system is not evolved to adapt to that or benefit from it, and it can cause serious problems.
Great. That is super thorough and makes a lot of sense. That's awesome. Okay, the next question was if you could give a 30-second elevator speech to convince for non-scientists who are interested in the subject but are not able to really do a deep dive into the science, is there a simple irrefutable summary in like a 30-second elevator speech. And I feel like you started off this with when Laura was asking, what do you hope for people to get out of the book? And if I recall correctly, the two main things is that wildfires don't catastrophically harm forests, but they do harm communities and rethinking that dynamic. So am I saying that right? Do you want to add anything on?
No, I think I took more than 30 seconds to say it initially, but that's the basic message. If I was to try to say it, excuse me, in 30 seconds, I would probably say wildfires don't destroy forests. They can destroy communities. Right now, we're spending almost all of our resources trying to stop fires out in forests. It's not working. It's often making them burn faster and hotter toward towns with tragic consequences. We need to focus our resources on creating fire-safe communities and stop the backcountry logging based on the misguided notion that fire is destroying forests. Because in fact, after these big fires, including high-intensity patches, the habitat, if it's not logged, is comparable to old-growth forest in terms of biodiversity and wildlife abundance. That might
Which
have been
I
40.
Well, and that's one of the things that I just found to be the most fascinating and just like really cool. I love I just love that whole shift because I got into forestry because I love old growth. And then to learn that there's this and I remember in the book that you were comparing the movement of raising awareness around the biodiversity and snag forest is really similar to the wave of momentum 20, 30 years ago of educating people about the importance of old growth forests. That was a huge movement. It's like, hey, everyone, old growth forests are super important. Put it on your radar. And now it's about snag forests with this wildfire narrative. And I thought that was a really cool way to kind of frame the evolution of these ecological movements that we're developing. Uh,
Right.
Cool. Okay, so this is from Australia. I thought it was really cool how, and especially in the more science-heavy book, Nature's Phoenix, you cite research from all around the world. And we have one person who lives in Australia, and they had a question last time, is that it's really hard to believe that the forest fires aren't making climate change worse. How can it be true that there were more fires in the past? If climate change is now worse, if fires were worse in the past, should we not be concerned about the amount of the fires that are going on right now? Just kind of hashing out the dynamic of like, all right, so the historical fire regimes of forests, there's evidence that there were much more wildfires before suppression, but at the same time, climate change is making fires worse because of drier conditions,
Yeah.
heavy wind conditions. So if you just want to hash out those nuances of
Yeah.
more fire in the past in the context of climate change is exacerbating wildfire conditions.
Sure. Yeah. And I generally, present the issue as fire is either increasing or it's decreasing. It's not better, it's not worse, it's not bad or good. It actually can be good, it can be bad, depending upon the natural range of variability. So this is the key issue for me. In any given ecosystem, you don't want too much fire, you don't want too little fire. And there are some ecosystems where we have too much fire, like chaparral, the shrub ecosystems in Southern California. We have too much fire. That's a combination of climate change and human ignitions because those chaparral ecosystems just happen to be adjacent to some of the largest population centers in the country. And at any given time, it's a dry, arid environment, a lot of warm, sunny, dry, windy days. Any given time, there's someone doing something dumb that can cause an ignition. And so you get a lot of fire. We have too much fire in that ecosystem. It's one place where I actually support suppressing fires from a purely ecological standpoint, as well as protecting communities because they're often right next to towns. So it's about whether you have too much or too little. In most forest ecosystems in the U.S., and this is true of many forest ecosystems globally too, we have a lot less fire now than we did historically before fire suppression. Now, climate change is definitely a factor, and climate change actually is increasing fire occurrence. Most of the research indicates that fire intensity is not increasing, but annual area burned is going up. That could be a good thing or a bad thing depending upon the ecosystem. In forests, it's not a bad thing because we're below where we should be and we're increasing. We don't want to overshoot the mark, though. So that's why we need to keep an eye on it and make sure that we don't end up having too much fire. But right now, we still have a deficit in most forest ecosystems. So, as to the question of climate change, um, after I published Smokescreen in 2022, we published a study from it was Harmon, Hanson, and De La Sala, the three of us. We did 4.5 years of intensive field research, taking the most detailed measurements ever on many hundreds of trees in two very large fires, the Rim Fire of 2013 and the Creek Fire of 2020, both in the Sierra Nevada. And the question we were asking is, what percentage of the tree biomass, what percentage of the tree carbon is actually consumed and emitted from these really big fires? Because the hypothetical assumptions that were out there from the land management agencies and studies that they had published that were purely theoretical was that it ranged from anywhere from 30% up to 80% of the tree carbon was actually consumed and emitted immediately when the fires occurred. We found after 4.5 years of intensive field research and incredibly detailed measurements on hundreds and hundreds of trees, we found that it was 1.2%. 1.2% of tree carbon is consumed and emitted. Even these are not typical fires. These are the larger, more intense than average. We wanted to go to the larger, more intense fires and find out what was happening there, even the more extreme examples. 1.2%. Now, of course, that is an amount of carbon that's emitted, and we didn't include duff and litter, and that's an extra amount. But most of the carbon, of course, is in the trees, above ground carbon. Now, because there's so much regeneration, and not just the trees, not just the conifers and the oaks, but also the shrubs and the forbs, there's so much biomass that starts to grow and it accelerates, and more every single year post fire, that is reabsorbing that carbon, not the same carbon molecules, of course, but the same amount very quickly, and can often exceed the pre-fire carbon levels within a relatively short period of time. So you can kind of think of it as ecosystem, exhaling and inhaling in a way. And if the ecosystems are not logged after the fires, if they're not salvage logged, then the retention of carbon in the ecosystem is remarkably powerful over time. Logging is what removes massive amounts of carbon, including like even a really light so-called thinning project will remove 15, 20, 30% of the carbon in the forest, just for perspective. A more typical thinning project these days will remove 50, 60, 70% of the carbon. But your really, really big, intense wildfires are removing between 1% and 2% conservatively of the tree carbon. So, it's logging that is the big carbon, and you'll get to this in chapter 5. It's logging that's the carbon bomb, not fires, really. Even though you can certainly make calculations and say, here's how much carbon this fire emitted, or this particular fire year emitted in whatever country or whatever state. What the folks who produce those reports and the news services who report on those reports, what they're missing or what they're leaving out, which I think is misleading, is how much carbon is reabsorbed by the ecosystem if those areas are not logged.
Definitely. And I think that just relates to a lot of the miscalculations of the industry about carbon. When they're talking about replanting and the amount of carbon that they emit in relation to what they're quote unquote sequestering through wood products and replanting, there's just the variables are incorrect, and it's the same with wildfire. And I think what I've been trying to do personally is really just realize that like to see more to utilize this understanding of the wildfire narrative as a way to hash out that logging is what we're trying to address here. Wildfire is almost kind of like a distraction in the media from what's really going on with the logging industry and the amount of carbon that it's producing as a whole. And yeah, because I with forest evolving for millennia with fire, it is just intuitive that because of the tremendous amount of regrowth that occurs from a mixed severity fire, it's going to be absorbing a lot of the carbon. Um, awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. Let's go back to these questions. Um, so one hot topic that we really have here in Washington is to better understand thinning. Because thinning thinning is a word that can mean a lot of different things. And and a lot of the thinning that is happening on federal forest in relation to, combating wildfire, quote unquote, is like high volume thinning. It's removing a significant amount of biomass. It's often removing mature trees. There's not a lot of oversight about what is actually being removed. And those type of thinning operations aren't benefiting the forest. But then there's also ecological forest management thinning, which can be done for restoration, in some instances. Because, for example, there's we deal a lot with state lands where our kind of main focus is conserving older forests on state lands. But we're also trying to advance not just conservation, but also ecological management. And we have our own terms here in Washington. For example, variable density thinning removes 10% to 40% based upon whatever the desired outcome is. So variable density thinning from a state perspective is seen more as potentially for restorative practices. And then there's the VRH, which is essentially clear cutting, variable retention harvest. So there's a lot of push for us citizens to have the DNR move away from variable retention harvest, which is a euphemism for clear cutting, and move more towards variable density thinning, specifically in the context of thinning homogeneous, overstocked artificial plantations, and using thinning more towards structural complexity and biodiversity. And so using thinning as a tool to restore poorly managed homogeneous plantations, as opposed to using thinning to go into structurally diverse or structurally complex forest and removing biomass under the claim that it's like, preventing wildfire from removing fuel loads. And then
Yep.
one more thing, I know this is a really long-winded question, but I'm just kind of prepping you because we really want to advance ecological forest management here in Washington, and thinning is a hot topic. And the two other terms that I'll throw out there is there's a term called um, thinning from above, which means like going in and moving the biggest trees, and then thinning from below. And thinning from below, from my understanding, means removing the smaller trees and leaving the large old structures. So we'd love to just hear your nuances of thinning based on like ecological forest management practices versus thinning as a
Yeah.
tool to supposedly mitigate wildfire.
Yep. So yeah, no, that's a good framing of the issue. So first of all, from I look at hundreds of these projects that the Forest Service is proposing. And you can, if you search hard enough, find a thinning project that's really about small trees and they're really not removing any timber volume. You can find that, but the vast majority of these projects, and this is in the Sierra Nevada, it's also in the Northern Rockies, it's in the Pacific Northwest, it's in the Southwest. The vast majority of these projects are commercial logging operations. Most of the wood, most of the biomass, most of the carbon that's being removed from the forest is in the form of mature and old trees. Even if numerically small trees are the largest category, the largest number of trees, they don't make up the most of the carbon. So those few trees that they're removing that are mature and old, they make up far more carbon than the small trees that they're removing that are actually more numerous. So at the end of the day, most of what's coming out in these thinning projects is actually the mature trees. I will say this from an ecological standpoint. Look, if people want lumber, if they want to remove trees from the forest for commodity purposes, then my suggestion is just be candid about that. But from an ecological standpoint, I don't believe removing trees, removing carbon from the forest improves the forest. I don't believe that is necessary to reintroduce or maintain fire in the ecosystem. What I think you can do in a homogeneous young tree plantation, for example, is you can simply reintroduce fire. You don't need to remove trees before you do that. You can also do snag creation. You can girdle trees, you can fell trees, you can do all kinds of things to create heterogeneity and habitat that will store carbon, provide habitat in ways that a stump can never do. A snag is habitat, a snag is stored carbon, a downlog is habitat, a downlog is stored carbon, it's nutrient cycling. A stump doesn't contribute much of anything. And so from my standpoint, the conversation is a little bit misplaced because I don't see habitat being created by thinning. I see habitat and carbon being removed by thinning. From a wildfire standpoint, and by the way, there was a question on this in the list of questions, and I just want to mention this so I don't forget it. Since I published Smokescreen 4 years ago, I produced numerous fact sheets that I wrote and with citations that I wrote mostly for non-scientists, but also interested scientists. So people would have a reference for a lot of these issues on numerous different issues, and they're on the John Muir Project's website. So you can go on the John Muir Project's website, www.johnmuirproject.org, and you can find those fact sheets and download them for free, and feel free to send me questions and ask questions if you have them. But one of the fact sheets we call fire alone, and basically I just assembled half a century of wildfire studies, mostly from the Forest Service's and the Park Service's own scientists, where they just went into these incredibly dense forests, some very dense tree plantations, some dense old growth forests, lots of down logs, lots of snags, some that hadn't burned in 120 years. And they went in and they just did burning. They didn't remove any trees. There was no thinning beforehand. And the point I'm trying to make is that we have literally half a century of science telling us that it doesn't matter how dense the forest is. It doesn't matter if it's a dense young tree plantation or a dense old growth forest, or if it hasn't burned in 120 years, or if it has some really high number of trees per acre. That's not the issue. The issue is fire. For fire is weather and climate. And if you're burning during mild fire weather, you're going to get mild fire conditions if that's what you want. So the whole narrative that you have to thin before you burn if the forest is really dense is not consistent with the scientific evidence. And we address that even more directly and expansively in chapter 11 of the new second edition of the Nature's Phoenix book that we came out with last year.
Great. That really helps. So in the context of wildfire, there really is no direct correlation in thinning helping wildfire, since it's mainly dependent upon weather and wind conditions. And then within the context of ecological restoration, thinning is never really a requirement for restoration. It's more a medium ground where if you need to harvest for commercial purposes, then you can do it in a more ecological way through thinning versus clear cutting. But from a purely ecological standpoint, there are ways to integrate structural complexity into a homogeneous stand that doesn't require thinning. And you mentioned introducing fire, girdling trees, leaving stands. So that really helps render it out that like thinning is not a requirement to restore an area, but it is a tool if one of your other objectives is removing wood for harvest purposes, which is kind of a happy medium if you're wanting to like support local wood economies, et cetera. It's like managing forest for a multitude of purposes and trying to tread as lightly as possible, perhaps improve the stand and get some board feet out of it at the same time.
Yeah, this has been one of my messages over the years. If you want to remove trees for commodities, for lumber, just say that's what you're doing, but don't wrap it up in terms like forest health or fire management. Don't tell me it's ecological restoration, because the data just don't really support that. Now, on the point of thinning and wildfire. And I talk about this in Smokescreen, and we talk about it quite a bit also in the new version of Nature's Phoenix book. There are dozens of studies over the last 25 years that say thinning effectively reduces wildfire severity. There's no question. There are dozens of studies that say that. And there are dozens and dozens of studies that find the opposite. And so people oftentimes throw up their hands and say, well, we've got all these scientists that disagree and all these studies that contradict each other. What are we to think? And one of the key things that I think that I try to communicate to folks is that there's actually not really a distinction between these. It's not really a conflict. It's that there are some key things that those dozens of studies that promote thinning as wildfire management, a number of key things that they leave out, and a number of things that they're not telling you. And once you understand those, you realize there's actually not a conflict between these things. It's just that those studies are maybe a little bit misleading. So I'll just give you a few examples. Number one, and I would put this at the top of the list, those studies, without exception, really, I can think of a couple, maybe one or two that have come out really recently where they've incorporated this a little bit, but they do not tell you how many trees they killed and how much carbon they removed from thinning before the wildfire occurred. And when they report the results of thinning, they do not include tree mortality from thinning. So they omit all of that mortality. And I've talked to some of the scientists that have produced some of these studies, and they said, oh, well, because we decided we were thinning for forest health, we don't have to report mortality because we were doing it for benevolent purposes. And my response is, your whole study was about fire severity, which is a metric of tree mortality. If you're not reporting tree mortality from thinning, that's fundamentally misleading and dishonest. So just as an example, imagine you've got two stands of forests. They're identical. They both have 100 trees per acre. One of them's thinned, and they remove 40 trees per acre of the thinning area, which would be a fairly light thinning these days. The other one, of course, is not thinned. Then a fire comes through. One stand has 60 trees per acre remaining. The other stand has 100. And the fire kills, let's say, 50% or 30% of the trees, or a third of the trees in the thinned area, so 20. And it kills 50% of the trees, or 40%, let's say 40, in the unthinned forest, so 40 trees. So now, what have you got left? You've got 40 trees per acre in the thinned area, and you've got 60 trees per acre in the unthinned forest. But that study will report that thinning significantly reduced fire severity because you had 1/3 mortality versus 40%, 33% mortality in the thinned forest versus 40% mortality in the unthinned. And that's what's been happening for literally a quarter of a century. And it's not just tree mortality, it's also the carbon, because, of course, when the fire kills trees, the tree is still there. It's now a snag. The carbon is there. Wildlife habitat is there. The thinning, that carbon is removed, and you've got a stump. So that's one of the big ones. But the other one, and this one is so insidious, and people don't even think about it, understandably, is that the Forest Service picks and chooses what they do and what they choose to do a study on. And because fire behavior and fire severity is driven overwhelmingly by weather and climate factors, thinned areas will burn at low intensity or high intensity, depending upon what the weather dictates. Same thing with old forests that haven't been thinned. It's overwhelmingly the factor. So you're always going to be able to, if you search around, you're always going to be able to find a fire in a thinned area that burned at low intensity, and nearby an old forest that wasn't thinned that burned at high intensity. And if you cherry pick those areas and you do studies on those areas and ignore all the counterexamples, you can manufacture a narrative and a body of evidence that appears to support the notion that thinning effectively curbs wildfires. The only way you get around that is to do a comprehensive analysis of all the fires in a given region. And when researchers do that, what they find is that the thinning is, if anything, is associated typically with higher fire intensity and severity, mostly due to microclimate effects. And it's not just me and my colleagues who have published research on this in the Bradley et al. 2016 study, of course, which I talk about in Smokescreen, but also subsequent research that's come out since I published Smokescreen, like research from the Forest Service's own scientists, Lesmeister et al. 2021, a really, really big study on the same subject, coming to similar conclusions that we came to, because they studied all of the fires in a given region instead of some, but not mentioning others.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Yeah, I really liked, I remember exactly in the book where you went into the details of describing two stands of 100 trees each, and the thinning doesn't even account for the tree mortality of the thinning of itself, which seems like a pretty obvious thing. So the next question relates to high severity fires. And and trying to hash out this narrative of the catastrophic scorched earth, a forest that is just totally annihilated, it won't grow back. And that's referenced a lot. There's a lot of images of these barren landscapes with like, this won't go back, this won't go grow back. It needs intervention through essentially turning it into a plantation, which often includes salvage logging. So, from just based upon the mountain of research that you've done, and I guess this would actually be a good time to reference the 25-mile fire in Chelan. So this was a mixed intensity burn. There was severe and intense fire locations that don't seem to be regenerating, and that was at this point about 4 years ago. So, like, what determines if a high intensity fire causes permanent damage? And I think a lot of that depends upon like what the historic regime of that forest is and what it's accustomed to. But just for fun, since we do have some images from one of the book club participants, let's see if I can do a screen share here.
Yeah, please. I tried to access that photo. I couldn't do it, but if you can screen share, I'd be interested in seeing
Okay.
that.
Okay, great. Let's do it. So I think I have screen share. So let me go ahead and run this real quick.
Do we
Okay.
know how many years post-fire the photo was taken?
I don't, but is Suzanne here?
Important information.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see. Okay, yeah, here's
I'm here and I took the
Susan.
pictures. So some of them were taken like a year after, and some of them were taken this year,
Okay,
which
thank
would
you.
show that there hasn't been any change in the the vegetation. This was taken this year. This is and that picture right there was taken. The fire was in August, and that picture would have been taken the following spring. And
Yep.
I took this because it kind of shows that the ground was hydrophobic, like it was so sterilized from the fire that the following spring it wouldn't even hold water. But then later, if I were to go back there now, it would. That's a snork. Okay, okay. This picture is 25 Mile Creek. It's where the fire was in a legal target practicing fire. The people fled after they did it. This is where the creek runs through. It was really heavily vegetated, really lush, not logged, not touched, and it just burned everything like toothpicks.
Yeah, so I mean, I see a lot of regeneration, even at the scale of this picture. I see shrubs. I
Right.
see what looks like they might be oaks. As far as conifer seedlings and saplings, you have to actually do field plot data, and you have to get down on your hands and knees, and oftentimes crawl around and actually look for the seedlings. You can't see them from a distance or even just by driving by. In fact, oftentimes if it's early years post fire, and of course, even now at 4 years post fire, that's very early years. The seedlings and saplings will oftentimes be growing through the shrubs. They'll be growing through pockets of understory vegetation, and sometimes they'll be growing in the gaps between, but oftentimes growing through the understory vegetation. You literally have to get down and pull the branches apart to see the seedlings. Now, 4 years from now, they're going to be overtopping the understory vegetation. They'll be overtopping the shrubs. They'll be very easy to see 4, 5, 6 years from now. But what I have found is oh, and by the way, just a note about hydrophobicity. I'm not a hydrologist, but I have worked with a number of conservation hydrologists who are experts on this. What they have told me is that hydrophobicity is actually a very rare phenomenon, even within the category of high severity fire. It does not happen often, and it's very, very fleeting. It usually lasts about 10 months. So, and it's not a natural thing. It happens. Um, the main thing I would say is any area that burns at high intensity, whether it's chaparral, whether it's a forest, within days or weeks or even months after the fire, it's going to look like the one picture you showed, where it's bare ground, and you've got charred, dead trees. And to many people, it looks bleak because it looks like nothing's going to regenerate there. The reality is the soil's not sterilized. The mycorrhizal fungi communities remain intact, and the forests regenerate. I have been doing field research specifically and overwhelmingly focused on large, high-intensity fire patches in forests. I've been doing field research in that particular subcategory for over 20 years, And I have never once found an area that wasn't regenerating. Now, in some areas, it's mostly conifer. In some areas, it's mostly oak and some conifer. In other areas, it's chaparral with with more scattered conifer and oak or other aspen or other species. The successional trajectory is going to be variable, and that's a good thing. That's diversity. But what I don't find are areas that are just barren landscapes where the soil was sterilized and nothing will grow. That's simply not happening. That's not something I've ever experienced, and I've been doing this again for 20 years and more fires than I could count. The only places where I find real sterilization and no regeneration and a barren landscape, even oftentimes 8, 10 years after fire, is some areas where post-fire logging has occurred, where the soil damage and the disruption to the ecosystem was so severe from the logging machinery and the removal of vegetation, and then oftentimes the pile burning, or bulldoze giant, all the slash into giant piles, put accelerant on it, and just let it burn and burn and burn for many, many days, even weeks, and just cooking the soil in ways that a wildfire never would. I will see areas like that even a decade later that basically support nothing but invasive grasses. But that's not what you find in the absence of post-fire logging. And in fact, I've issued a challenge numerous times to U.S. Forest Service scientists to show me a single hectare of forest in a high intensity fire patch that burned and was not post-fire logged or managed after the fire, where it's just barren years after the fire, and isn't regenerating. And there have been no takers. No one has been able to point to a single hectare. They just change the subject or don't respond. So for my part, I've never found an area like that, not at any meaningful spatial scale.
And if I
so
were to go back
that's
to
good.
that now, it would have a lot of vegetation. My question about the kind of toothpick trees, that was a very lush spot where it was cool. It was next to a large creek that was traveling through, and yet it burned all the trees, as you can see. So I guess I had a question about that. Is that just because it was a kind of a climate change driven hot day with wind and it just went through and got everything?
That's exactly right. And just to be clear, climate change is influencing fires for sure. But we had hot, dry, windy days, long before climate change and long before humans existed, and they were causing high intensity fires. This has been going on for not thousands of years, not millions of years, not tens of millions. It's been going on for hundreds of millions of years, about 350 million years of evolution with forests and fire on this planet. So yeah, it's the weather. That was the weather dictated that the area would burn hot and would kill most or all the trees. And I would say, they're not black sticks, they're not toothpicks, they're snags. That's snag forest. And in my experience, by several years post fire, maybe 7, 8, 10 years post fire, typically, if those areas are not logged, those snag forests are as lush or more than the mature old forest was before the fire occurred. They are incredibly diverse, wildlife rich, lush ecosystems. There is so much understory vegetation and so much richness. I took a reporter from the New York Times into one of these snag forest areas that the Forest Service told him would never regenerate, and it's a barren wasteland, et cetera. And they said all this stuff. So he said, well, I want to see it. So I hiked him into a few areas, just fairly typical representative areas that had not been post-fire logged or planted. And he said, this is like a rainforest. And this was about 7 years post-fire, after in a large high-intensity fire patch. So that's just to put this in perspective. That's what natural succession will do in these areas. But I just don't see, in my experience, I've never found or seen any barren, lifeless areas that don't regenerate after high-intensity fire, even in the biggest high-intensity fire patches that I've ever seen. And I have never been able to get an answer from any of the Forest Service or logging industry scientists who claim that there are such areas when I ask them where those areas are located. And I said, you know what? Just send me coordinates. Just send me coordinates. I'll go out there and hike out there and I'll find it for myself. But they won't do that. And to me, I take that to mean that they are not, they can't back up what they're saying.
Great. That's really helpful, especially with 20 years of experience focusing on high intensity fires, to have never found an example that is scorched to sterilization and no life. I think that really helps. Like whenever that's mentioned in the media, it's probably exaggeration, hype, just like like it's either probably a totally an untruth, or they're showing images that are just too recent because anything 2 months after the fire rolls through is going to look hectic. And then the third is that if it is completely unsterile and dead, years later, it's because of post-fire logging, salvage logging that has sterilized and compacted the earth. So that really helps clears it up because there is this huge narrative that's misleading around scorched, barren, sterile, never regrowing. And if you've never in your entire life have seen an example of that in a high intensity fire, where no post logging has occurred, that's really helpful to hear. So,
Yeah, I mean, I'll put a fine point on it. I will say that that's fire mythology of our modern society, and I think that most of the folks who say that, who believe it, who repeat it, are doing so innocently.
yeah.
I believed it. I said things like that. I passed along those messages for years before I ever started researching this stuff because it made sense to me. It seemed intuitively right. If you have a really high intensity fire patch, it's got to be bad. It's killing the trees. That's got to be bad. It's got to be destroying the soil. I'd see places right after the fire, and I would think that's what's going to look like even 10 years from now. And it's understandable. It really is. But the reality is good news. It's really good news. These areas regenerate wonderfully. They're incredibly biodiverse. They're incredibly carbon rich, and they don't need our intervention. And this is why I say that we have to focus on saving homes and lives from fire at the communities that are most at risk. We have to focus on helping the communities, especially that can't help themselves as well because they're not wealthy. There are lots of wealthy communities that are hiring their own fire brigades. They can they can put on a metal roof or any fire resistant roof they want. They can do any kind of home hardening activities. They can do annual defensible space. But there are a lot of communities that don't have those resources, and a lot of those are being the ones being impacted the most. And to me, I feel like the current policies coming out of Congress are unconscionable because they want to double down on the failed practices of the past, which is backcountry logging, telling communities it's going to stop the fire from reaching them, which is, in my opinion, a dangerous lie. It's getting people killed.
Yeah, it'd be really helpful if they just said what they're doing as opposed to creating this really elaborate ruse of restoration lingo to mask backcountry logging. It's definitely so complicated, as anyone who's worked in conservation for a while knows, changing narrative and all the weight's on us because the like big timber is able to put forth these really kind of elementary like planting trees are good, and then all the weight is on the conservationist to explain all the nuances like, well, you know, planting trees may be good, but not cutting down older forests is way better, and converting them into plantations is even worse, and it's all these nuances. But it's incredible that you've gotten so far with hashing out these nuances. Again, like older forest conservation and the big movement of understanding the Pacific Northwest old growth groves. That was a huge explosion of we never whoa, there's biodiversity in the canopy of old growth. We never knew that. We thought that the canopy of old growth was a biological desert, and then this huge explosion of knowledge, and now we're doing the same thing just with
Yeah.
wildfire and snag forest. All right, so
By the
oh
way,
yeah,
before your next question,
yeah,
I, I mentioned this too that uh, deserts are like forests are incredibly biodiverse ecosystems. So oftentimes the narrative is really that they're biological wastelands.
yeah.
But you know the reality is that they're all highly biodiverse ecosystems, even if they look a little severe like deserts. They might be an acquired taste, but I love them. I actually started out as a desert conservation activist before I was a forest before I got into forest protection.
Yeah, and I really like the fine line of power of words and deserts. That's not, yeah, deserts are full of life, and if anything, like the most resilient, powerful life lives in deserts. Like the strength of life in a desert is
Yeah,
phenomenal.
in many ways. Sorry, that was a distraction. Yeah, ask your next question.
No, that was great. Let's see. So I'll ask a couple more, and then I can I'd like to, all these questions that I'm asking are from, or were submitted from us, but I'd also like to just give room for where people are at right now and any questions where they have
Sure.
right now. And I know that Laura has some questions as well. I've been talking a lot, so I kind of want to pass the mic, but let me ask one that's I think fairly easy because we're probably in agreement with this one. Is the question is so thinking of the boreal forest, right? It's really apparent on Google Earth when you look at the northern forest, the boreal forest, that so much of it has been clear cut and converted into monocrop plantations. And the question is are these monocrop forests more at risk for catastrophic wildfire than an unlogged forest or a forest that has naturally regenerated? And at least for us on state land, we're arguing that older, naturally regenerated, structurally complex, mature forests are much more fire resistant and resilient than a plantation. And you go into detail on that too, like epiphytes absorb an immense amount of water, downed wood, downed logs are essentially sponges. These structurally complex biodiverse forests
Yep.
absorb so much water. And just from my own experience of going out in plantations versus the older forest right behind my house in the middle of summer, a plantation looks like it's going to erupt into flames. An older forest, you can still find water running through it, even the height. So to answer myself, I do think it's alarming that there are so many plantations in the boreal forest. So I'll pass
Yeah.
them over to you on your thoughts.
Well, so no, this is a really good question. Most of the research out there does find that plantations burn more intensely, more severely, depending upon your metric, than dense old forests, all things being equal. What's interesting is that the difference is not that great. One study was done by some friends, colleagues of mine before I met them. This was Odian et al. 2004. This was done in Klamath-Siskiyou bioregion, northwestern California. And they looked at many different fires over the course of decades. And they found in different conditions. And they found that plantations burned at 16% high severity. And mature forests burned at 12% on average. It was a statistically significant difference, but it's also not a dramatic difference. Now, other studies have found, excuse me, larger differences, but other research has found no difference really. There was a study by a bunch of Forest Service scientists that looked at the fires in the 2020 fires in Oregon, and they found that they were actually not outside the natural range of variability, and that the different forest conditions really did not burn that differently. They were pretty similar. And their conclusion was it was overwhelmingly dictated by weather and climate factors. Hot, dry, windy day, you got really intense, fire. If the weather moderated, you got less intense fire effects. And so, to me, it underscored the point that this is really about weather and climate, much more so than it is about structure. Now, I will say that most of the research does indicate that higher density forests, more carbon in the forest, does create a microclimate that, all things being equal, will tend to make fires burn a little bit less intensely. But it's not going to be a night and day difference. They will tend to burn less intensely, but they can still burn, and they do at high intensity, and that's been going on for millions of years. It's not a bad thing or unnatural if a dense older forest burns at high intensity. You just, again, you don't want too much, you don't want too little.
Yeah, in some cases, it's a lot of species are dependent upon it, like you referenced the
Yeah,
black-backed woodpecker as
many.
well. I'm seeing a couple more questions pop up. I think one of them has already been answered. It's about the hydrophobic, how high intensity fires can cause hydrophobic soils. But that is a temporary. What you said earlier is that's a temporary issue.
Rare and temporary. Even within the high severity category, it's very uncommon and it's very fleeting.
So it's just like, something that rarely ever happens, but people tend to hyper focus on it because it suits the
Yeah,
narrative.
exactly. It's also not a bad thing. Like I said, that pulse sedimentation is a natural and necessary thing for aquatic ecosystems. They benefit from it. Aquatic ecosystems and aquatic biodiversity benefits from pulse sedimentation from high intensity fire.
Mhm.
And I think maybe like part of the context of Janine's question is, that AI sort of responds with this narrative and, how might that have come to be sort of the status quo for
Yep.
people
You,
looking to
you're,
get information.
you want to say that one more time, Kaya? It sounds like it didn't come through for me. I don't know if it was just me or if Kaya was
I
breaking
heard
up.
it.
Oh, you did? Okay, I guess it was just on my end. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think it's the kind of AI interpretation. That's a good way of putting it. I like that because yeah, the narrative often comes off that way. And I see Rick has had his hand up for a while. I want to make sure I answer your
Yeah,
question as
let's
well.
go for it. Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, actually, it's a comment more than a question, if that's okay.
Sure.
And first, I just want to say thanks for the book. It's a really interesting read. Um, and I'm going to preface my comment with a little bit of background of history. Is that um, I litigated for and against corporate entities for about 30 years before I retired up here, and I have a lot of experience with large international corporations, including the oil industry. And I think this comes through somewhat in your book, but I just wanted to emphasize that it's hard when you read this book, to believe that the extent of misinformation and falsehoods and outright lies that are coming out of the timber industry. Um, and I think it's important to remember that the people who work in the timber industry, especially on the ground, are not the people creating that information. They're, I found this with the oil industry, hundreds of depositions of people that were working in the refineries. They were not the problem. They were just doing their jobs. They were doing the best they could. They thought they were doing good work. But it is a high level corporate um,
Yeah.
plot, for lack of a better word, to provide misinformation, to mislead, to use this information to create a political and business narrative that supports what they want, which is more money.
Yeah.
And it's important to recognize that, but also that the people at the lower levels working in industry they're not the bad people.
Yeah. Yeah. If I can
They're just
respond
as
quickly,
misled as we are.
I think that's very, very well put. And in fact, as you get into later chapters, I make that very point. I have a whole chapter dedicated to that point. And I make the point that, like, taking the U.S. Forest Service, for example, the agency is not monolithic at all. There are all kinds of good people in the Forest Service at different levels, and many of whom are putting their reputations and their careers at risk, doing the right thing or trying to do the right thing, sometimes in secret, sometimes overtly. There's a lot of good people, but a lot of people also are trying or would like to do the right thing, but they're being beaten down and forced to do the wrong thing on a daily basis. So I think this is a really, really important point. And I have worked with a number of people in different agencies, sometimes openly, sometimes covertly, when they're not in a position to do it openly. And so I will work with people of good faith anywhere I find them, honestly.
Great. Well, let's. Thanks so much, Rick. A very, very important point to hammer down is the big money is a big issue. But I'd love to open it up to everyone for questions. We have Rob next, and I also know that Meredith has some questions as well that I wasn't able to get to. So please just raise your hand, and if there were any questions, is there any questions that I missed, or
We've
if you have
got
any
one
additional
more in the
questions?
chat from Judith, I think that we wanted to hit, and then Rob was next.
Okay, great. So we got this one in the chat is how do disease trees play into the picture? Are these areas more prone to fire? Should we remove disease trees from a forest? And you got into good details about bark beetles, and essentially like disease infestations are really similar to snag forest, where they're an important habitat.
They are. They're actually a type of snag forest. The snag forest habitat can be created by drought and native bark beetles, or they can be created by fire. Usually, it's fire. It's much less common in most areas for areas of predominantly snag dominated habitat to be created by drought and bark beetles, but it does happen. Mostly it's smaller spatial scales, but there are some large patches out there too. What's interesting, and I talk about this in the book, that there's a really large body of research by ecologists going back decades, researching those areas and the wildlife diversity and abundance. And it turns out it's very similar to what we're finding in snag forests created by high intensity fire patches. It's incredibly biodiverse, usually even more comparable or even greater in terms of biodiversity and wildlife abundance than old forest. And that's saying something, because old forest is incredibly biodiverse and incredibly wildlife rich. So these areas are ecological treasures. They are not destroyed or damaged. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. You want an ecologically healthy forest has to have a lot of dead trees and patches of dead trees, whether it's drought and beetles that cause those conditions, or fire. You have to have that. You cannot have a biodiverse, ecologically healthy forest without those conditions and without those natural disturbance processes creating those conditions. And so I guess, kind of going back to, I think, the first question, if people take away one thing from my book, it's that, well, two things. It's that when trees die in individually or in patches from natural disturbance processes, this is not the end of life in a forest. It's in many ways the beginning of life. A snag, a down log, they contribute enormously to the biodiversity and to wildlife abundance in those systems, and many species are dependent on it. And the second thing is, you want to protect communities from fire, you focus on the communities, not out in the backcountry. And yeah.
Amazing. Cool.
Thank
Well,
you.
yeah. You're welcome, Judith. So next we have
And by the
Rob.
way, I'll also mention this, and I had this in the book also, is that most of the research out there indicates that areas with a lot of dead trees from drought and bark beetles, and these are native beetle species, they don't tend to burn more intensely when fires occur. There's really no signal from that. The overwhelming majority of research out there, I've contributed a little bit to this too, but most of the other researchers who have done more work on this, that's what they find. It's really not the factor. It's, again, it's weather and climate.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like the dead tree narrative, it plays into people see something that's dead, and if they don't understand the
Right.
complexity of forest ecology, they think it's bad, right? No one wants to die themselves, right? Death, like we live in a taboo culture where death is taboo, and so it's like this forest is dead, we might as well just take all the wood out of it. And that ended up
Right.
in Canada. I watched a really cool kind of like citizen science video where when they had the really, really bad floods in just north of us in Canada, they began to understand that the major floods that was happening in BC was because of the largest clear cut that has ever happened on Earth, because of there was a huge infestation outbreak, and they salvage logged the whole watershed. It was like literally the largest clear cut on Earth. The largest clear cut on Earth was a salvage log of an infestation, and it just completely messed up the hydrology up
Can you
there.
do me a favor and email me some information on that particular clear
Yeah,
cut?
they're really fun videos. I will. Let me make a
Thank you.
note, and then I'll
Yeah.
pass it off. So
But I
we'll
want
have
to make sure I get the other questions too. A
yeah.
few. Yeah.
So we have Rob, Meredith, and then we have a question in the chat, and then we'll jump back to Susan. So take it away, Rob.
Okay, yeah. Well, if you could put a link to that in the chat, that would be great too, what you were just talking about.
Okay, I may have to send it up in a follow email. I don't. I'm just
Okay.
making a note. I may have to dig, but I'm gonna
That's
make.
fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
When you get a
Yeah,
chance.
I just
Perfect.
want to talk a little bit more about fire and plantations. I noticed in those big fires on the East Coast last year, the year before in Canada, a lot of that was plantation. And I'm wondering, because you spoke of plantation and old growth as not being tremendously different in terms of severe fire, but in terms of total acres burned or other types of fire, is there a difference, or are you basically saying that plantations overall are just a fairly minor element in whether a place is going to burn or not?
Yeah, exactly. What I'm saying is that there's an impression that plantations will almost always burn at high intensity when a fire occurs because they're young, they're homogeneous, and they're dense. And that's not what the data support. The data support the conclusion that the plantations will largely do what the weather dictates. All things being equal, they will tend to burn at least somewhat more intensely than a dense old forest, mostly because of microclimate factors. But my message is this: is that in my opinion, from in the context of the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, the best thing that we can do with plantations is nothing. Don't log them. Reintroduce fire, sure, or let fire happen as it will. But you can just leave them alone, and nature will form that plantation. And I've seen this over and over and over again over decades of research in these areas. Nature will form that plantation into a structurally diverse, carbon-rich, biodiverse ecosystem if it's left alone. And in my experience, human intervention rarely advances that proposition. It typically undermines it. Now, there can be exceptions where you're not removing anything from the system, snag creation, down log creation, where the plantation has not gotten to the point where you're starting to get pockets of natural mortality. And but what I've seen is in those plantations that are just left alone where they're not maintained, pockets of trees will die. Native shrubs will start growing and wildflowers in those areas. Tree species that weren't planted will start growing in the gaps. You will start getting that complexity and more carbon richness as the trees grow. That will happen naturally.
How long does that usually take?
Oh, I mean, it's a continuous process, So like the first place I noticed this was in a plantation that was 25 years old. And it was amazing what was already happening. And you could see the trajectory of it. You could see, okay, but by the time it's 40 years old or 50 years old, this is going to be a completely different system.
So
And to me, it's heartening. It really is very, very hopeful.
And you said that plantations need to be maintained. What is involved in maintaining a plantation?
Oh, no, I'm not saying they need to be maintained. I'm saying that's the industry's position is that they create a plantation and then ideally they would like to maintain it. But oftentimes that doesn't happen. When they maintain it, that means if shrubs start growing in, they come in and remove them. If species that are not the favored timber species start growing in the gaps between trees, they remove them, et cetera. So, and they may remove, some of the trees too, maintaining the plantation. They want to, remove a certain amount of the timber for commodity purposes. So if it's just left alone, nature will turn that plantation which is not contributing much in its early years to carbon storage. It's not contributing much to biodiversity. It's not contributing much, but if it's left alone, nature will turn it into a carbon-rich biodiverse ecosystem, complex ecosystem.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. So Meredith?
Hi there. I actually have four things, and I'll be quick with it. What's the best way to take care of the forest? What do you think about non-natives? What about planting redwoods? Because where we live, we have 5 acres, and the red cedars and Doug firs have been falling, and especially the red cedars have been really stressed with climate change and with people building above us and cutting down a lot of the trees, creating more wetland area, and some of the trees can't handle that. And then I also wanted to know about I was shocked about the Nature Conservancy, and I started researching some about that, and because that was in chapter 10, and I was really upset about because I'm a teacher. I got kids to donate, to save rainforest land. I worked in a school. The kids didn't have a lot of money, and we collected money to help save the rainforest. And then reading about the Nature Conservancy was really just Like,
Yeah, the Nature Conservancy has been a bad actor on these issues, and they've been really bad at the past few years. Even worse since I published Smokescreen, actually. But then they got called out by about like 150 different um, biodiversity, environmental justice organizations, and creation care organizations, faith-based organizations trying to protect nature. They got called out by I think 150 or 8 organizations a couple of years ago, and there was some press on it. They're kind of exposed, and they've been a little more cautious since then, but they're still doing some bad stuff behind the scenes. But I'm sorry, can you say your first question again?
my first one was about what's the best way to take care of the forest?
Oh, thank you. That's like the perfect question. Protect them from industrial exploitation. Protect them to the greatest extent possible from human intervention. Enjoy them, explore in them. We make them accessible to people so people can understand them, because so many people are so disconnected from nature. They're so disconnected from forests. I get the craziest questions, people calling me or emailing me, and it's understandable because they don't have experience in these places, and if you don't have experience with them, you're susceptible to the mythology and the misinformation. And so I think we need to protect a lot more forest, and not just mature and old growth forest and roadless areas. Yeah, we need to protect those. Absolutely. They're incredibly important. And not just snag forest habitat. We need to protect plantations too, so they stop being plantations in the future. Because as long as we're in there intervening, they're probably going to stay plantations and they're not going to contribute much. So that's what we need. We need a lot more forest protection. And we need to start transitioning away from our current patterns of wood consumption. It's back to the question earlier about thinning versus clear cutting. Like, you can do just as much damage from a biodiversity standpoint and from a carbon removal standpoint if you thin 3 times as much acreage or clear cut a third as much acreage. It's not really about thinning versus clear cutting. It's about protecting a lot more forest and starting to shift away from wood consumption, because our wood consumption and our logging levels, not just in the US, but globally, they're wildly unsustainable. And if there's one key message again from Smokescreen is we cannot overcome the climate crisis just by shifting away from fossil fuels. We have to protect, dramatically increase protection of ecosystems, our best carbon sinks, so they can draw down more of the excess carbon in the atmosphere. And the biggest bang for the buck by far is forests.
Thank you.
Sure. I can do a couple more. I do have to run in a little bit, because I'm doing field work. I'm doing some research on post-fire natural regeneration in giant sequoia groves. So I was just out in the field for 4 very intense field days. I just got back in to have this conversation with you all, which I'm really thrilled to do. And again, thank you so much for coming and having this talk with me. And I'd be happy to do it again, by the way, in the future, if you all would like that, because there's a lot here to talk about. So if you want that, I'm more than happy to do that. But I'm not at home. I'm on the road, and the only restaurant in town, it's a very small town, is at a certain time. And I am very, very hungry.
Okay, well,
you're a lot of miles today to some very difficult country. But I want to make sure I answer any questions that are still out there.
Okay, well, we have 2 more hands up, and then there is. Can we do 3 more questions, and we'll just
yeah, sure.
Okay, let's do it. So we'll start with the one in the chat. So it says, I sense a sense of skepticism in your book towards human-influenced fire, and there seems to be preference towards natural lightning-caused fires. Wondering if you could speak to this, given the legacy of intentional anthropogenic fire systems on this continent. So just, and I've you touching on it a little bit in your book, where like it's my interpretation of what you wrote is that you're pro-indigenous or anthropomorphic fire systems, but often prescribed fires in an institutional sense from the U.S. Forest Service is very, very different.
What I'm against is abuse of prescribed fire. I'm not against prescribed fire. I support prescribed fire in certain circumstances. I certainly support indigenous cultural burning, and I support managed wildfire, lightning strikes that cause a fire, and allowing the fire to burn for habitat benefits. I support burning, as long as it's not an ecosystem that has too much fire. Sometimes I see proposals to do prescribed fire in Southern California chaparral, and that's an ecosystem that has too much fire. You don't want to add more to that. But the main thing I want to communicate is, and I've said this many times, is I want I want us to, as a society and the agencies, to excuse me, allow more lightning strikes to burn. We need more managed wildland fire. I'd like to see the agencies reduce or remove the administrative burdens that they put on tribes for decades. And those burdens have an ugly, frankly, racist history, so that tribes can do more cultural burning in places where they haven't been able to in the past. I support that strongly. I think that there is a role in some circumstances for prescribed fire, but what I don't want to see is logging projects and slash burning spun as prescribed fire, which I'm seeing increasingly by the Forest Service. And I don't want to see prescribed fire applied in ways that is unnatural and harmful to the ecosystem. I talk about this in Smokescreen in chapter 12 in particular, where this is a real problem, particularly in the eastern forests, where land managers don't understand fire history and they've just made a mathematical error. And they're applying prescribed fire every 2 years in ecosystems where the natural fire frequency might have been in the dozens of years. And it's actually really, it's kind of like deforesting certain areas. It's really alarming what's happening in some areas. And so, prescribed fire can be abused, and I don't want to see prescribed fire abused, but it can be a buffer around communities to protect them from fire. It can be used to get more low intensity fire in a system that may have a deficit of low intensity fire, but it has enough moderate and high intensity fire. So there's a role for all these things. What I don't want to see is logging masquerading as fire management or masquerading as a necessary precondition to burning, which it's not. The data just don't support that.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay, so our final two questions of the night, we have one from Susan and one from Pamela. I don't know who was first, so I'll just let you two duke it out.
I have a really quick question. We talk about biodiversity, but we're not talking about, we haven't mentioned the birds and the wildlife. And, I've seen from the fires I've grown up in a lot of bears that die or get they're orphaned. And the snakes and the things, squirrels and stuff. Do you have any research on that? Thanks.
This is a great question. In any fire, there will always be some number of animals that get caught in a weird position, a box canyon maybe, and then there's an updraft of wind that spreads the fire a little faster in that area. There's always going to be some places, or the fire, they get circled by the fire and they have to go through the fire to try to get out. That will happen. It's not that common, but it will happen. But the overwhelming result of fire is an abundance of wildlife and biodiversity. And so there's a lot of bad information out there about massive losses of wildlife species or animals, individual wildlife species because of individuals among different wildlife species because of fires. And I think what a lot of this is rooted in the idea that fires in forests move at these rapid speeds. And this is part of the mythology of fire. You'll hear this a lot, faster than a bird can run, or a bird can fly, or faster than a deer can run. And I talk about this in Smokescreen. I quantify it. I use a number of different fires as examples. I'm not sure if you guys have gotten to those chapters yet, but the bottom line is that forest fires are extraordinarily slow. They really are. Grass fires are actually pretty damn fast. Forest fires are not. If they're moving at 3 or 4 miles an hour, that's getting to like near record territory, and it won't happen for very long. Mostly, even the biggest fires, on average, they will move on average at about 1/10 to 1/50th of a mile per hour over the course of the time period that the fire is burning. They're really, really slow. Animals they don't even have to run. They simply walk out of the way, or go into the ground, into holes, or go into a down log that's intact. There are lots of different ways that wildlife species have been doing this for millions of years. But again, there always are individuals that can be hurt or killed in a fire. That's going to happen, but that's not the overwhelming balance of results from a fire. Wildlife populations benefit and typically increase. All right, last one.
Okay, I'll go. I've lived in Western Washington my whole life, over 60 years, and one of the things that seems new and is has freaked me out and a lot of people that I know is the smoke and the air quality problems that we've been having. And I don't remember it my whole life until the last, 6 years. It seems like we've had four falls where people can't even go outside. And so what you're saying about building materials and making communities that are fire resilient makes complete sense to me. Um, and is it just that because of climate change and weather change, this smoke is something that we're just going to have to live with in the future, or is this a perception that it's new on my part and it's really not new? As far as, my lifetime goes, it seems new.
Yeah, yeah. No, this is a great question. No, it's not new, but two things have changed in recent years. Fires are getting closer to their natural levels that occurred before fire suppression. In part, that's because more land managers are letting more fires burn. In part, that's because of climate change. And also, we have more human communities and more people in communities closer to where fires are burning. So those two things have changed. There's been significant patterns over the last 40 or 50 years in both directions. So more people are experiencing smoke from fires now than they were 40 or 50 years ago, or even 30 years ago, because we have more fire, not too much in forests, but we have more, and we have more people closer to them. So for me, it's I think a lot of people are sort of tempted to say, well, can't agencies or politicians do something to stop the fire so I don't experience the smoke? I understand that reaction, but the reality is they're not going to stop the fire. Certainly not with logging operations, thinning, clear cutting, whatever they're doing. That's not going to stop the fires. These are weather events. Fire is an exothermic chemical reaction. It's not going to be stopped by removing trees from the forest. But what we can do is we can do a much better job protecting communities. And I think this question you're raising is really, really key, because a lot of people aren't talking about the impacts of smoke to people. And it can be really significant for certain individuals. It really can. A lot of people have various preconditions that make them more vulnerable to that kind of smoke. So we need to have the conversations about how we can help people who are vulnerable, not just from fire burning down their house or potentially threatening their life, but also how we can help people deal with the smoke that might impact their health. And these are solvable problems. These are things we actually can do, but we have to get politicians to stop focusing on more logging bills that will roll back environmental laws and subsidize, take more billions of dollars out of taxpayers' pockets to subsidize more backcountry logging that is going to make the climate crisis worse, that's going to make the biodiversity crisis worse, and it will often make fires burn a little bit faster toward communities and put them at greater risk. Instead, take those resources and use it to help save homes and lives and protect public health in the communities when wildfires occur. That's where the conversation needs to be. And meanwhile, increase protection for forest ecosystems, acquire more private forest lands into public ownership, and protect it from human intervention. This is an essential climate crisis remedy. It's not something we can wait till after we shift away from fossil fuels. It's something we have to do now. It's equally important that we protect our best carbon sinks, so that they can draw down the excess carbon. We cannot overcome the climate crisis if we don't do that.
Amazing. Everyone, I know everyone's on mute, but let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you so much for all the really, really smart and thoughtful questions. I greatly appreciate it, and for everyone coming together and having this conversation with me. Like I said, I'm happy to do it again in the future. In the meantime, excuse me, I've got just a lot of dust in my back of my throat hiking around in dusty environment all day. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of Smokescreen, and and do check out the Nature's Phoenix book if you want more reading on this, and also John Muir Project's website. We have a lot of information there that you'll find useful, I think.
Amazing. Well, go get some good food, get some good rest, and we really
Thanks,
appreciate
everyone.
your effort and your time.
Thank
And
you,
yeah,
Chad.
you can get
It's
on
been a
out of
pleasure.
here, and Laura, Kai, and I will keep lingering to say goodbye to everyone. But Yeah, all
All
right.
right.
Take care, Chad. All the best to you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Yeah. Great. I will send a follow-up email with information about the BC clear cutting of the infestation. I'll also give links to Nature's Phoenix. This is more of a scientific textbook, so it's definitely an investment, but it's an incredible resource of information. So I highly, highly recommend it. It's co-authored by Dominic De La Sala, who's another kind of renowned old growth conservationist. It's really interesting how old growth conservation and wildfire knowledge are intersecting. Um, so we in the follow-up email, we'll also get back to you on the forest walk, which is coming up. It's definitely going to be January. Judith, are you here, Judith? Or January, June 29th. Okay. So we're thinking about going to the Lake Whatcom Fire because it's really accessible. But Judith, who I don't know if she's still on the, she is here, was talking about another fire that's close by on Highway 20. I went down a rabbit hole and was researching all the different fires that are like relatively close to us. And we'll choose one, but I'm probably gonna, on my own accord, go and visit other ones because I'm really fascinated about what fires look like after a burn. Uh, but Judith, maybe you can email me or send me more information on the one that you're referring to. Okay. All right. She got a thumbs up. Short story is we will follow you up with a bunch of details. June 29th, we're going to do an adventure together where we can meet up in person to a local fire, whether it's Lake Whatcom or another one close by that is on the radar. We'll get back to you. Kaya, Laura, do you all have anything else to wrap up that I'm forgetting?
I was just gonna say, I know we have a lot of folks from different time zones and different communities, and I encourage everyone to do a little research and see if there are some interesting and easy to access sort of compelling fire sites near you that you could explore and maybe bring a friend or two to really bring some of these concepts to life. So join us even if you can't physically in spirit.
Yeah, I love that. Let's all whether you're gonna join us on our hike on June 29th or whether you go explore one on your own near wherever you live, if you don't live near Whatcom County, let's June 29th get out and experience a post-fire firsthand. Great. Well, are there any other questions or logistics or comments before we call it a close? And like I said, I'll send a follow-up email with more info and etc.
I just wanted to say thank you again for everybody coming tonight and just thanks for everybody's participation in this. Just really, really enjoyable, informative evening. So thanks again. And as Daniel and Kai have said, we'll email you with all of the updates for next month. So thank you again.
Okay.
Good
All
night,
right.
everyone.
Well, take care. Everyone get good rest, and we'll see you in a month.
Thanks so
All right.
much.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Have a good evening. Bye, y'all.